As I was doing some reading to prepare for today's reflection, I found this really interesting article about the Ten Commandments as the law of Christ. That's not what made the article interesting, though. You see, instead, at the end of the article, the author launched into this discussion to try to illustrate how the law and Christ function together. And he started to talk about Bill Belichick. Now, for those of you for whom the mere mention of this name doesn't make you coil in disgust or jump for joy, Bill Belichick is the longtime coach of the New England Patriots football team. He's the conceiver of Deflategate and Spygate and probably a number of other controversies that my husband, a Philadelphia Eagles fan, would be more than happy to enumerate for you. But despite all of this and your opinion about whether Bill Belichick is really Bill Belichick, you cannot deny that under his coaching, the New England Patriots have won the Super Bowl umpteen times. And they've won the Super Bowl this many times because Belichick, well, he has a system. In that system, there are definitely some players that just don't fit. They might be amazing, they might be super talented, they might be incredibly phenomenal players, but in his system, they just don't work out. But then there are these other players who are clearly less awesome. They're definitely less talented and they're not nearly as skilled as many of their peers, but within the system, they just excel. And they get this way by drilling hard and practicing how to react in so many different game situations that eventually they can react almost as if by instinct. But here's the thing, right? It's not instinct at all. It's the freedom that comes from having gone all in on the discipline of this particular system. That's what Bill Belichick is really good at. But what on earth does it have to do with Deuteronomy 6 or with Jesus? It's okay if you have no idea where I'm headed with this. We're going to come back to Bill Belichick in just a little bit. In Matthew chapter 22, verses 34 to 40, we hear the Pharisees try and test Jesus. That's not unusual for the Gospel of Matthew. And really, the story these particular verses tell, that it actually starts a few verses earlier. We're told that the Jewish leaders are trying to trap Jesus in his own words. And so they ask him a series of questions. We hear them ask questions about whether the faithful should pay taxes. And then the Sadducees come in and they ask questions about the resurrection. And then the Pharisees come back with this question: Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest? What Jesus tells them here, it isn't new. It's not innovative. And even in Luke, it's not his own words. Instead, it's at once ancient and also incredibly familiar. Twice a day, the Jewish faithful recite the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength. Jesus doesn't wing this one. He quotes scripture, bringing his interrogators back to the very beginning, to the place where it all began, to that Exodus moment and that Sinai event. Hear, O Israel, is an imperative. It's a commandment in itself. Listen, Israel, God tells God's people. Listen to me. It turns out that the greatest commandment really has two parts to it: to listen and to love. Hear, O Israel, listen to me, God commands us. You see, God knows that we're a distracted bunch. It doesn't take a whole lot to shift our attention from what we intend to something that we didn't intend at all. So God says, listen to me. Listen to me above all of the din that distracts you. Listen to me over all of the things of this world that vie to capture your attention. Listen to me. God's call to listen. Well, it's also a call to remember, a call not to forget. Remember that I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. You see, our most primal seduction, the thing that seduced Adam and Eve in the garden, the thing that seduced David and Solomon, the thing that continues to seduce us now is amnesia. It's the desire to forget that we ever needed help, that we weren't self-sufficient, that we couldn't handle things on our own, that we don't deserve to have what we have. In the seduction of amnesia, we create a narrative of chosenness. We are blessed because we are intelligent, because we are pious, because we are good. And then we create a narrative that those that don't seem as blessed as us aren't as intelligent as us, not as pious as us, not as good as we are. And in the extension of this amnesia, we start to think that it's not even that we were chosen for our blessings, but that we are, through our own efforts, just born into this, just born blessed. We start to talk about bootstraps and self-sufficiency, and if I can do it, then so can they. And we forget. We forget that we would still be slaves in Egypt if it were not for the mighty hand and the outstretched arm of God. And so when the Pharisees asked Jesus what the greatest commandment is, he starts out by reminding them that the core of all of this is what God has done and is doing. Not anything that they could ever do, even if they could keep all 613 mitzvot perfectly. What is the greatest commandment, they ask. And Jesus responds with listen, and then he tells them to love. To love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind and with all your strength. Y'all, we have an issue with the verb love. We do. You can blame it on the Victorians maybe, but in English, when we say love, we get all soppy. Love for us is an emotional response verb. It's not a verb of action. In the 21st century, we feel love. We don't do love. But the Hebrew understanding and the first century CE understanding of love is action oriented. It's contractual. The 10 Commandments are actually based on ancient contracts. I'm going to lay down some history for you now about something called the Hittite suzerain vassal treaties. Those are words, right? I promise it's more interesting than it sounds. These are treaties that a more powerful king, a suzerain, offered a less powerful king as a vassal. In these treaties, the suzerain would document previous events in which they did a favor that benefited the vassal. The purpose of this would show that the more powerful kingdom was merciful and giving, and that therefore the vassal should obey the stipulations presented in the treaty. The treaties would discuss the relationship between them as a personal relationship instead of a solely political one. And the vassal would agree to future obedience for the benefits that they received in the past without even kind of deserving them. The suzerain loved the vassal. The vassal loved the suzerain. It was a love of action done through obedience. Now, when the Greeks translated this Hebrew understanding of love, they used the word agape. Agape says kurion ton theon su, Jesus tells the Pharisees. We translate this phrase into English as you will love the Lord your God. Now that's not wrong, but it's also not quite right either. We lose the nuances of the Greek and we make love pretty one-dimensional here. The Greeks understood love in nuance. And agape, it's the type of love that is universal, unconditional, and transcends and persists regardless of circumstances. This is the love that says that even if the vassal is really bad at keeping up their end of the treaty, the more powerful king will still love them, meaning that the more powerful king will still continue to uphold their end of the treaty. Why? Well, because this kind of love, this agape, absolutely seeks the best for everyone without expecting anything in return. And here's the thing. You can do that without actually liking the person or people that you love. Because you see, this love is action. It's action oriented. You don't have to feel it. You have to do it. You have to live it. So when Jesus tells the Pharisees, and by extension us, that the greatest commandment is to love God with all our heart, soul, strength, and mind, he's telling us that we're supposed to be doing something. Even here, though, we have a tendency to move toward the soppy area of feelings. Heart, soul, and mind for us are all inner workings, and we can get caught up in the emotions again here and forget that there's supposed to be a doing too. But when we look at the Hebrew, we can start to unpack these words. In today's scripture from Deuteronomy 6, we read heart, soul, and strength. A heart is the place of inner will, and soul means our life force, and strength, well, in Hebrew, it's the word miad, which can mean force, but it also means abundance or wealth. It refers to our stuff. Basically, we're supposed to love God with everything that we desire, everything that we are, and everything that we have. Everything that we have. Oh man, that's a hang up for people. And it was a hang up in the first century too. We haven't changed that much. The Pharisees tried to trap Jesus into a conversation about it by asking about taxes. Render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, and render unto God that which is God's, Jesus told them. The Pharisees, they didn't understand. Render unto God everything that is God's. But what is God's if not everything? Everything that we desire, everything that we are, and everything that we have. He was telling the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Herodians and all of the factions that were laying claim to knowing the only true way to worship God, that if they had to ask a question about taxes, they were missing the forest because they were getting so caught up in the trees. We do that too. Although the Jewish legalists had 613 mitzvot, Christian legalists invent new laws all of the time. The way a woman dresses, the amount of drinks that are considered acceptable at a party, the number of times per month that a person attends church, the language a person uses, who someone chooses to marry, who someone votes for, whether or not someone wears a mask, and the list, it goes on and on and on. Sometimes we get really hard on the Pharisees in the Bible for their rule-following ways, but let me tell you, U.S. Christian culture can be so much worse than the Pharisees could have ever imagined. We're really, really good at losing the forest because all we're spotting are the trees. But you know what? We're also really good at forgetting that a forest isn't a big, homogeneous green blob on our Google Maps. You know, we read, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and strength, embroidered on a pillow, and we get all up in our feels. I do love God, we say. I love God so much. I love God more than coffee, even, we say, as we brandish our coffee mug that has love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and strength in vinyl on it. Stores like Lifeway and Altered State have done a superior job of giving us little rustic wooden signs and bracelets with matching earrings that remind us to love all. It's easy to love God if all that love requires is that I feel some sort of generic way about a pretty generic God. In the genericness, we have a tendency to only focus on the emotional response love verb and never on the action of the love verb. We easily set aside what feels like legalism in the Old Testament, and we replace it with a generic God who just generically wants us to be good people. Our golden calf moment isn't an actual golden calf. It's a wall hanging that says live, love, laugh. And it's all the result of the cunning and seductive call of amnesia. Hear, O Israel. Jesus appeals back to the Shema, not because he's a legalist and not because he's talking about some generic God, but because he knows that we're always on the verge of forgetting that the God of Abraham, Jacob, and Isaac isn't the God of the dead, but the God of the living. God's words to our ancestors are not just engraved on stone tablets, but are supposed to be engraved on our hearts and minds, tied around our wrists and bound to our foreheads. They are not just words on how we were supposed to live as a people in a desert, but as people in high rises and townhomes and cities and in suburbs too. Hear, O Israel. We do not have a generic God of generic love. Instead, like the Hittite vassals, we have a powerful king who desires a personal relationship with us, not because of who we are and what we can do or what we can offer that king, but because of who that king is. Jesus takes us back to that moment when we stood at the edge of the water, watching as Pharaoh's armies were swept away. Jesus is drawing us back with the force of the Exodus to our moment of emancipation, to the waters of our baptism, to our adoption as children of God. Hear, O Israel. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind. Jesus is at once admonishing us that it is not enough to follow the rules if we forget the why of the rules, and that God's covenant isn't dependent on whether or not we followed the rules at all. But Jesus is also reminding us that left to our own devices, we find ways to strip God's commandments of any punch at all. And that brings us back to Bill Belichick and his system. In Belichick's system, you drill hard. You practice the scenarios where you might struggle in a game, and you go through them in exercises, and you watch them on tape. You discipline yourself to take on every part of the system until all of a sudden the system is a part of you. And you no longer have to think about what to do next. You just do it. The 10 Commandments and the old Hebrew laws, they don't exist to crush a person. Covenantal obedience, it isn't a dirty word. When Jesus tells the Pharisees and Luke, do this and you will live, he's not saying that if you don't choose God, God will smite you right then and there. That's not what Jesus is saying at all. Instead, he's saying that practicing God's commandments, truly living into them with your heart, mind, and strength will emancipate you with the force of the Exodus. The Old Testament law isn't there to keep you from living. Instead, within God's system, the system becomes a part of you so that you no longer have to think about what to do next. You aren't debating whether or not to pay your taxes or whether or not you ought to give a few dollars to the guy with the sign who's standing in the middle of the road, because you know that the question is so much bigger than worldly kingdoms. It's about the heavenly kingdom and its building blocks of justice, mercy, faith, and love. No, I'm not saying that Bill Belichick is God, Patriots fans. I'm not. I am saying, however, that his system works. And I'm saying that God's system works too. Hear, O Israel, God's covenant to us, made on Mount Horeb and renewed in the person of Jesus Christ. It frees us from a life twisted upon its own anxious self for an emancipated life in sync with the Creator, whose love does for us what only God's love can do. Make us whole, free, and complete. Hear, O Israel. Love the Lord your God with everything you desire, with everything you are, and with everything you have.